When we talk about the Roman Empire and we talk about Britain, frequently we've mentioned in the past few episodes about how the British viewed the Roman invasion, or at least a perception of how they might have viewed them. We've looked at how Roman invaders perceived Britain, but the one thing we didn't really do is talk a little bit about why. What was it that was drawing Britain to Rome and Rome to Britain? And why was it that the politics of both areas were slowly starting to mesh towards one another? And why was it that the Romans really intuitively thought that the next logical step was to take Britain? We're going to talk a bit about that today. Welcome back to the Roman Britain podcast, episode 5, Imperium, Ante, Provinciam. When Rome first reached Britain in the middle of the 1st century BCE, it did not arrive as an empire looking to settle. It arrived instead as a republic in crisis, led by a general who needed prestige more than territory. For nearly 100 years after that moment, Britain remained close to Rome, but never fully inside of it. Roman merchants traded there, British kings visited Rome, Roman authors wrote about it, and yet no legions returned. The reason is simple and deeply Roman. Rome could not conquer Britain until Rome had decided what kind of state it was going to be. And in this particular episode, we're going to look at why Britain was left alone and how Roman civil wars shaped imperial priorities, and why the invasion of Britain under Claudius was as much about survival in Rome as it was about the power overseas. When Julius Caesar crossed into Britain in 55 BCE, he did not do so with a long-term military plan. He tells us this himself. In the Commentary di Bellio Gallico, the Gallic Wars, or his commentary on the Gallic Wars, Book 4, Caesar explains that the British tribes had aided resistance in Gaul, and that expeditions to Britain would discourage future support. But the tone of the text suggests something more performative. Caesar repeatedly emphasizes novelty, danger, and the unknown. This was the unconquered land across the great ocean. It was unknowable and difficult to understand. Britain is presented literally as the edge of the world. He describes unfamiliar tides, chariots, and warriors who fight in ways Romans do not expect. These passages are less tactical reporting and more political storytelling. Caesar needed victories that mattered back at home. We've discussed a little bit about that a few episodes ago. At this point in his career, Caesar was deeply in debt and politically vulnerable. His enemies in the Senate were waiting for him to lose command. A spectacular achievement could protect him, he hoped. Crossing the ocean, even briefly, did exactly that. But Caesar never intended to stay. After a difficult first landing and a larger second expedition in 54 BCE, Caesar took hostages and extracted promises of tribute, but then he returned to Gaul and never really ever looked back. His job was done. He'd achieved what he wanted, and he didn't care anymore about taking land or conquering an area. There were no garrisons, no colonies, no governors. Britain was a headline, not a holding. Within 5 years of leaving Britain, Caesar was fighting Romans, not Britons. In 49 BCE, he crossed the Rubicon and triggered a civil war that destroyed the Republic. The consequences were vast and immediate. Armies instead became political tools rather than instruments of expansion. Every legion mattered. Every campaign had to serve domestic survival. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Rome fell into chaos again. The Senate's authority collapsed, armed factions dominated the streets, political violence became routine, and out of this turmoil emerged the Second Triumvirate, formed by Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus being the major junior partner in this particular incident. This was an alliance of trust, sort of. It was an agreement to divide power and eliminate enemies. Appian, writing in his Civil Wars, describes the proscriptions with horror. Lists of enemies were posted publicly. Property was seized. Families were destroyed. Senators and equestrians were hunted through Rome itself. In this environment, Britain was effectively irrelevant. No Roman leader could justify sending troops across the Channel when rivals threatened Italy, Greece, and the eastern provinces. The legions that might have conquered Britain were instead fighting Philippi, Perusia, and eventually in Actium. The Republic did not fall because it expanded too far. It fell because it could no longer agree on who ruled it. And of course, when Octavian emerged, eventually victorious, and became Augustus, he inherited not a wealthy, strong, and powerful empire, but a broken and broke state. Augustus understood something his predecessors had often ignored. Expansion was optional, stability was not. The res gestae divi Augusti, or the achievements of Augustus, he listed carefully the things that he had done. He emphasizes restored temples, settled veterans, secured borders, and peace. Conquests appear, but they're selective in their description. One thing to keep in mind with the Romans is they didn't look at civil wars as being conquest or as something noble. They're something that had to be done. So they twisted themselves into 50 million knots to make it look like it was a foreign war and celebrate a victory over a foreign enemy so that they could have a triumph at the end of these civil wars. Like Mark Antony isn't the opponent, it's Cleopatra and the Egyptians who are the opponent for Augustus. It's this idea that it's the foreigners that are breaking us up, not us who are breaking us up. And that kind of thing was fairly common. And specifically, Augustus used this in a lot of the ways that he dealt with warfare. Augustus wasn't a warrior. Augustus didn't fight in wars. He was not a general. He did not lead armies. He was a politician first and foremost, and he knew that was his strength. And that was why he won, if we're honest. Because he knew that stability for the empire was critical in helping to get it past the point of being a broken, fractured system that realistically the last few years of the Republic definitely were, and one could argue that the last 100 years of the Republic were obviously that way. There's too much in strongmen taking over, starting to cause issues, other strongmen rising up to oppose them, and backstabbing and deviousness and prescriptions and all sorts of other horror shows of different ideas of how to eliminate various enemies became a part of daily life in Rome. And throughout that late Republic, it became untenable to keep things the way they were. So politically, they had to change. They had to make hard choices to make the state stable. And that's what Augustus did. And we will see something like this again in the 3rd century when the Roman Empire itself goes into another state of instability where it's crisis after crisis after crisis. And it's mostly internally driven crises that are creating a unstable situation, which then leads to a completely remodeled empire based on the idea of a Western and Eastern empire ruled by different Augusti or Caesars. And all of these people would then have influence over the state in their own locations, and in a way breaking up the empire before the empire even was broken. But all of this is yet to come, so we'll kind of ignore and skip by that for the moment. However, while we've talked a lot about what Rome was doing, Britain is only mentioned indirectly. According to Strabo, for example, Augustus considered invading Britain, but decided against it. Strabo writes that Britain had already paid enough in trade duties to make the invasion unnecessary. Tariffs, you might even say. This is a remarkable statement. It tells us that Rome had calculated Britain's value and concluded that occupation was not worth the cost. Instead, Augustus used diplomacy. British kings such as Tincamarus appear in the Roman records as guests, not enemies. Coins are minted in southern Britain that imitate Roman styles, and trade flourished between both sides as it had previously with the various Gallic states and kingdoms that existed prior to the Roman invasion. Tacitus later criticizes this restraint, but from Augustus' perspective, it's sensible. His priority was securing the Rhine and Danube frontiers, preventing another civil war, bringing stability. Rome really didn't have to do any other invasions or take any other territory. It needed to consolidate what it already had, and Britain could wait. And for decades, Britain has existed in a gray zone. Roman authors knew it, merchants traveled there, British elites adopted Roman goods and practices, especially in the southeast, where, of course, most of the trade and contact is coming from at this point. Yet, no invasion comes. Under Tiberius, foreign expansion slowed it further. Tacitus tells us in the Annals that Tiberius warned against reckless conquests. He preferred consolidation and internal control. In other words, he was continuing the same practice that his father, his adopted father, had wanted. With Augustus, stability overran conquest. Well, with this same perspective, Tiberius considered it important to maintain stability. Under Caligula, however, Britain became a farce. Suetonius describes Caligula ordering troops to collect seashells in the Channel coast as a spoil of Oceanus, conquering the ocean even though they didn't conquer any land. Whether exaggerated or not, this episode reflects the instability of Caligula's regime and his inability to lead in the field. Something that is, of course, Roman historians' favorite thing to do is to show that bad emperors were kind of useless as soldiers. And long before the Roman soldiers returned to Britain, Rome was already present there anyway. Quietly and effectively through diplomacy, trade, and client kingships, they were already influencing the daily life of Britons, at least in parts of Britain that had the most to do with the Romans. This, of course, was not accidental. Rome had learned that ruling through local elites would be cheaper and safer than ruling through legions. Britain became an experiment of indirect control, probably the first that they had done in the West in a long time. One could argue that they were doing it in Spain in the past, but certainly it was something that they had been experiencing in the East. They had done it in the past with areas that at certain points they directly control eventually, like Judea, for example. But at one point, those territories were controlled by client kings who effectively were the ones responsible for keeping everything safe, but yet were responsible to Rome financially and in other means because they depended on Rome to protect them. One of the earliest known client rulers is Commius. Originally installed by Julius Caesar himself, Caesar tells us in his Gallic Wars, that Commius was a trusted ally during the Gallic campaigns. After later rebellion and flight, Commius reestablishes himself in Britain, ruling among the Atrebates. This is, of course, significant. Caesar did not simply withdraw from Britain and forget about it, of course. He had 11 years between his last appearance. He had 10 years from his last appearance there to his own death, so he had time and the ability to consider it. And he had left behind political infrastructure to help continue the process of Romanization. Commius and his successors ruled territory that roughly corresponded to modern southern England, and their coinage increasingly intimates Roman styles. This was not cultural coincidence, it was deliberate alignment. By the reign of Augustus, Britain's elite were already looking to Rome. Strabo tells us that several British kings sent emissaries to Augustus and dedicated offerings in Rome. These kings were not conquered, but they were participating in Roman power and Roman display. One of the most important of these rulers was Tincomarius, likely a son of Commius. Tincomarius is known almost entirely through coinage, but those coins speak volumes. They bear Latin inscriptions rather than Celtic ones. They use Roman iconography. They present Tincomarius not as a warlord, but as a ruler in the Roman mold. At some point around the turn of the 1st century CE, Tincomarius appears to have been expelled by rivals and fled to Rome. Augustus, according to later Roman writers, received him as a supplicant king. This matters enormously. A British king could appeal directly to a Roman Empire and expect support. Rome was already acting as an arbiter of British politics. Further west in what would later become the core of Roman Britain ruled Verica. Verica's reign brings us directly to the threshold of invasion. Verica ruled lands in southern Britain during the early 1st century CE. His coinage again reflects this Roman influence, as he appears to have been a loyal ally of Rome. According to Cassius Dio, Verica was driven out by rivals, likely associated with the expanding Catuvalenian power to the north. Verica fled to Rome, of course, to escape this power. This was the critical moment. Cassius Dio tells us that Claudius used the appeal of an expelled client king as justification for invasion. Rome was not invading a free island, it was restoring order, defending allies, and reasserting authority. This, of course, is a familiar Roman script. Client kingships allowed Rome to claim moral legitimacy. The invasion of 43 CE could be framed not as an aggression, but as obligation. Britain, by this point, was not unknown nor untamed. It was politically entangled with Rome. When Roman legions finally crossed the Channel, they were not entering a foreign world. They were enforcing a relationship that had already existed for generations. Britain did not become Roman overnight in 43 CE or even in the aftermath of the invasion. It had been moving slowly and deliberately into Rome's orbit for nearly a century. The reality for Rome and for Britain was that even if the two sides had divided, in quotes, there was linkages between the two that were hard to miss. And slowly but surely, it was the conquest of Gaul that set this all in motion. Gaul was a key trading partner for Britain. Britain had so many links, especially on the southwest side of the or southeast side of the island, that linked back to Gaul. And then combine that with the fact that you have places like Tintagel in Cornwall, where there is a lot of tin and mining operations going on that are being used across the Roman Empire. This creates another trade relationship. And slowly, as this orbit continues, there is this thing that we see in Roman history, which kind of happens. And I get it's portrayed to some degree by the Romans, so you can't really trust everything about it. But I would also counter it by saying we have enough archaeological evidence to suggest that it's very true, and we've been showing it throughout this episode, is that as contact begins between Rome and these various kings and warrior leaders, you start to see them take on more and more aspects of Roman civilization, from minting coinage to creating links between themselves, using different items which have come from Rome, trying to model themselves after Rome. The success that Rome is having is kind of acting like a little spoiler effect, where it is driving interest in Rome and in its success and trying to mask the problems that are there, because everybody goes, oh, look at all that civilization they have. Look at all the neat things that they've got that we don't have. Look at all the roads they have. Look at all the different supplies and slaves and, the gold and jewels and marble and everything, especially if you're a client king and you're traveling to Rome and you're seeing all these things. Rome that now is at the height of its style and substance, keeping in mind that Augustus claimed that when he took over Rome, it was a city of brick and he returned it to a city of marble. There is this concept that he glorified the city, made it something new and exciting. And as people would come to the city and see these things, it would impress them. Nero would build his massive auditorium, which would eventually become the Colosseum, as we call it now. There were so much that, and by that I mean he didn't build the Colosseum, to be clear. It was later people who did. But it was the fact that that area became the Colosseum. Anyway, the whole thing about Rome is that it presented well, and people saw it as being a place to be. It was like going to, New York in the United States, or London if you're in Britain, or Paris if you're in France, or Berlin if you're in Germany. These major capital cities with all that they have with them, or major financial capitals in the case of New York, where they are so huge and so magnificent, and everything about them is so memorable. You have an idea and a concept of these places. I can say Paris, and people will already have ideas about what a Paris is. If I say London, you've got an image of what London is. If I say Tokyo, you've got an image in your head about what a Tokyo would look like. All of these things show in the way Rome is built. Rome is like nothing in Britain. Britain is nowhere near like Rome at this time. And so for a lot of people coming from, I don't want to say backwater, but let's call it that. Let's say they're rural backwater rulers who, maybe control 25 miles in circumference, coming to a place like Rome where the power is so intoxicating, where everything is just offered to you. Suddenly you kind of realize just how big it is, how impressive it is, how fabulous it is. And you can see why people would suddenly go, hey, I want some of that. Like, again, if you go back to it, no different than people going to London and coming back and going, I want a London-like thing here. Or I go to Paris and I see Paris and I get attracted to the style of Paris, to the buildings in Paris, to the art, to the culture of Paris. And they bring that back to where they live and try and, build on that style. Similarly, in other places and in other areas, you see this continued. And it's not out of jealousy. It's out of, this impressed me, so I want to have it here. I want to show my wealth and my power through showing how much like Rome I am. And that's what people like Tacitus get so worked up about when they start talking about the spread of Roman culture into places that the Romans have conquered, because his idea of the whole noble savage and the idea of freedom, that from his perspective is about the freedom of a nation rather than the freedom of, say, individuals, all based around the idea of not being Roman. And so to suddenly have this Roman situation and these people who are Roman, or at least culturally becoming Roman, bothered him to some extent, at least in his writings. And so when he talks about Britain, you'll see that he very much puts a spin that says that this isn't good, what we're doing here. And I think that's an interesting perspective, especially from somebody who's writing about a father-in-law who governed there. But nonetheless, I think that's an important aspect when we look at Rome and look at what Rome is doing and why it's doing it. And then we get to the political side of it all and why it's doing it because of that. And the reality of it is things in Rome had changed. Everything, in fact, changed in 41 CE. After Caligula's assassination, the Praetorian Guards elevated Claudius to the throne. Claudius was not expected to rule. Ancient sources portray him as physically impaired and politically marginalized. Whether exaggerated or not, perception mattered. Claudius needed legitimacy. Roman emperors proved themselves through conquest. Britain offered that target. It had resisted long enough to matter. It was close enough to reach, and it could be framed as unfinished business in Caesar's time. Suetonius tells us that Claudius personally traveled to Britain to receive the surrendering kings. This detail is critical. Emperors did not risk their lives on minor campaigns. This was something more than that. The invasion of 43 CE was not simply military. It was theatrical, symbolic, and political. Claudius returned to Rome and celebrated a triumph, and his name was secured. Conclusion: Britain was a political solution now. It was worth worrying about. Rome did not invade Britain because Britain had demanded it. Rome invaded Britain because Roman politics finally required it. Caesar had introduced Britain to Rome's ambitions. Civil war had removed the capacity to return. Augustus had chosen restraint, as had Tiberius. Claudius had instead chosen survival. Britain became a province not when it was most vulnerable, but when Rome needed conquest more than caution. And it is that in and of itself that defines the relationship between Rome and Britain, which allows it to become a province, which allows it to be controlled as a province, and creates the opportunity that Rome needed to finally take this, part of the island and begin the process of trying to Romanize it, something that it will find very difficult to do. And we will talk a little bit as to why in the next episode. So if you have any questions, comments, or concerns on this matter, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can always reach out to me on most social media at Welsh History Pod, the exception, of course, being Facebook, where you can reach us at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And of course, if you would like to watch these episodes, you can do so on YouTube at youtube.com/@Welsh History Podcast. Or, of course, on any of your audio feeds, you can listen to the podcast there. And if you would like to help and donate to this podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you all once again. Take care of yourselves. Have yourselves a great day. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye. The Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information about them, please follow them at evergreenpodcastnetwork.com. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.